Some of you probably laugh when I say this, but I think Daniel might be my favorite book. Seems like I say that about everyone that we get into. Daniel is such a precious book for us. But I wonder how you look at the book of Daniel. What lessons do you garner from this special book of prophecy? What lessons do you get from it? What do you hold as the things that we learn from this book? Would it be about Daniel in the lion's den? Because I remember that story. I remember that from when I was a child. Everybody knows the story of Daniel in the lion's den. And everybody knows the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the fiery furnace. Everybody knows those stories. But my question is, what are we teaching one another when we use those as the examples of the book of Daniel, as the lessons that we get from the book of Daniel? I want to read you something from Revelation chapter 17 and verse 5, because Babylon holds a very special place in the Bible. Revelation 17:5 says, "And on her forehead a name was written, a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth." This city, if you were to think of all of the cities that have ever been, what would be the worst in God's eyes? Well, evidently, the city of Babylon is the worst. Because in the book of Revelation, this is the city that represents evil everywhere for all time. And it's interesting that Daniel is taken into this place that is this seat of evil. There's a book that I would recommend to anybody. It's a book written by a minister named Larry Osborne. And it's about thriving in Babylon. Now, it's not just the Babylon of old, but this city of Babylon represents evil for all time. It's the kind of thing that if you understand how Daniel survived, and not only survived, but thrived in that environment, then you're going to understand why we have this book, the book of Daniel. In Daniel chapter 1, we read, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah." History is my favorite thing. I never did like history teachers because most of the history teachers I had in school were gym teachers or football coaches. And they were not interested in teaching history. But boy, once I got out of school and I was free to study history on my own, it became one of my favorite things. I want us to look into this city and understand what we should be getting out of the book of Daniel. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, oh boy, prophets have been prophesying about the end of Judah and Israel ever since they became a nation. But we see here that it says in the 3rd year of this one of the last kings of Judah, it says, "Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and he besieged it." Now, it must not have taken very long. But I want you to notice the next 3 words. The Lord gave. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. This wasn't something that was accomplished by Nebuchadnezzar. Even though he had accomplished a lot, it wasn't because of Nebuchadnezzar that Judah fell into his hands. And there were other things that happened. You know, if you go back in the history of these people, the people of Judah, One of the best kings they ever had was named Hezekiah. His son was one of the worst, or the worst that they ever had. His name was Manasseh. But during the days of Hezekiah, a great king in service to God, this great king got to feeling powerful and mighty, and he wanted to show off. And after he had been sick and recovered from his sickness, he had visitors from Babylon that came, and he wanted to show them everything that he had. So he took them into the temple. He showed them this magnificent temple that was built by Solomon. He showed them all of the vessels of gold, all of the shields of gold that David had made. He showed them everything that he had. And Isaiah came to him later. And Isaiah said, "What were these people doing here?" He said, "Well, they came to tell me how glad they were that I got better." He said, "What'd you show them?" He said, "I showed them everything." And Isaiah said, "I'm telling you what, they're going to come and they're going to take every stitch of this and they're going to take it back to their home." Well, that didn't happen right then. It didn't happen for a while. But right now, right here in this book of Daniel, we have the end of that nation that was crumbling from within, like every nation seems to do. Crumbles from within. Very few countries are taken from the outside. They crumble from within. The mighty ones do. It's what happened to Greece. It's what happened to Rome. It's what happened to the Persian Empire. It's what happened to Babylon. This nation of Babylon is going to crumble from within too. But right now, this nation is on top. They are the power of the world. And the Lord gave the nation of Judah into the hand of the king of Babylon. It goes on, it says, along with the king, he gave some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his god, Marduk, with a shortened name of Bel, kind of like the way we say God or we say Lord. Bel means Lord, but it refers to Marduk, the chief god of the Babylonians. Said he brought these vessels into the treasury of his God. Here's what Nebuchadnezzar believed. He believed his God was greater than all the rest of them, so he would conquer a nation, and he would take their chief idol, and he would take it and he would put it in a place below the statue of Marduk. He would show that my God's greater than your God. Well, here's the problem. The nation of Judah, the people of God, had no idol that he could take and put below his god Marduk. All they had were these vessels of gold. So Nebuchadnezzar brought them in, and he scattered them in places down below in submission to his god Marduk. Trying to show that my God's bigger than your God. And so what we have here is an example of what happened when God gave this nation into the hand of this king. So, what lessons are we going to learn from this? About the lion's den? Well, I'll tell you, I don't understand. If that's the lesson we're going to learn from the book of Daniel, I'm confused. I'd like for the Lord or Daniel to explain that to me, because what am I supposed to get from this? What expectations am I going to have from the book of Daniel about how God's going to treat me? Think about it for a minute. Does this mean that if I live like Daniel, if I have the attitude that Daniel had, if I am as much like this man Daniel as I can be, that God won't let a lion eat me? Does it mean that if I can be like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that fire won't burn me? Sometimes I think we look at the Bible and we get all of the wrong impressions about what we can expect from God because of what's written here. The book of Daniel is a magnificent book, but it doesn't teach me that lions won't eat me. And I'll tell you why. You know the favorite way the Romans had of killing Christians in the days of Nero was to feed them to hungry lions. Now, where's the lesson from Daniel if that's the case? If they were eaten by the lions, how were they to gain strength from the book of Daniel? You know what else? If we're going to take the next example, let me stop here for just a minute. I can only think of 3 different examples in the Old Testament where men were more powerful than lions, or had some kind of power over the lions. I know that David, now that might just have been David being a good hunter, but it says that David grabbed the lion by the beard and smote him and slew him. That kind of gets my attention. I know one case in modern times of something like that happened was in Vietnam. A Marine was in a foxhole, and a Bengal tiger jumped in the foxhole with him. As documented, the Marine grabbed that lion and he smacked him right in the nose, and the lion jumped out of there and ran off. Don't mess with the Marines. I guess is the lesson in that. But that doesn't happen very often. Just like it doesn't happen very often with lions. Only 3 or 4 times in the history of the world has a man overcome a lion. Unless he's got a gun. But you know, that's not the lesson that we learn from this. When we look at the story of the fiery furnace, that's not going to happen. One of the favorite way, I said the favorite way was lions, but another favorite thing that the Romans had to do, and Nero was famous for this because he used to light his garden in which he raced his chariot around. And he raced his chariot around wearing women's clothes. Something really strange about that man. But the way he lit his garden was by taking Christians' children, dipping them in tar, and using them as a torch. Where's the lesson of Daniel in that? If the lesson that we're supposed to learn from this, if the expectation that we're supposed to glean from this is that if we are like they were, we won't burn. Because I guarantee you, we'll burn. We will burn. So, what is the lesson? I look at this and I think, oh, we got the wrong message. Is the message that He'll rescue us? Yeah. Is the message in here that we won't get hurt? No, not at all. The exception is Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, not the rule. They are the exception to the rule. But let's read something else here. The real lesson I think we can find in Hebrews the 11th chapter. Go there with me if you have your Bibles. In Hebrews 11, beginning in verse 32, we read this. Now understand the chapter 11 of Hebrews that's the hall of fame of faith. This is where people did things that were unbelievable through faith. And it starts out talking about all these people that did these magnificent things by faith. And here's what we read beginning in verse 32. He says, "What more shall I say? For time will fail me if I tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah and of David, Samuel and the prophets, who by faith conquered kingdoms, performed acts of righteousness, obtained promises." Here we go with Daniel. "Shut the mouths of lions, and quenched the power of fire. That's Daniel. And escaped the edge of the sword. From weakness were made strong, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. And women received back their dead by resurrection. That's the good part. That's the good part. That's the victorious part. That's the physically victorious part. But look what it says next. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Let's go to them first. In Daniel chapter 3, here's what we have about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It said, they were told that when you see this statue, and we got to talk about that statue for a minute, because Nebuchadnezzar was God referred to Nebuchadnezzar as the greatest king ever. He referred to him in a dream that he gave Nebuchadnezzar as the head of gold. There are 4 nations that are talked about here. There's the Babylonian Empire, which he's the king of, and he really was the impetus behind all of the greatness of the kingdom of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar. It refers to him as the head of gold, and then the next was the breast and arms of silver, and then the belly and thighs of bronze, and the legs and feet of iron and clay. And there were 4 nations. That was, Babylon was the first, and the Greece was the second, or Medo-Persians was the second. Greece was the third, and then Rome was the feet of iron and clay. Well, this great statue with this head of gold must have stuck in Nebuchadnezzar's mind. Because after that dream, and after Daniel tells him that he is that head of gold, he decides that he's going to build a statue, a 90-foot statue of gold. And everybody in the nation is going to have to bow down before this when they hear the sound of the music. There must have been a special tune, kind of like Hail to the Chief or something like that. Some song that when it was played, everybody in the nation had to bow down and worship this image. He got that idea from the first dream. Just made him drunk with the glory of it all. So he says, unless you do, you're going to be put to death. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, and they said, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire. But even if he does not, and he will, he is able to deliver us from the furnace of fire, and he will deliver us from your hand." I mean, they understood something here. That is that God can keep us from burning. And either way, he will deliver us from your hand. It's hard for us to see things in that light. That being thrown into a furnace and dying is actually being delivered from the hand of whoever it is. That's exactly what they're saying. Here's what they go on to say, though. But even if he does not save us from that fire, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Wow. What strength of character. What kind of strength does it take to do that? When you know that you're going to be thrown into that fire, what chance in all of their past do they think they have of surviving being thrown in there? Here's what happened. The guys that were building the fire got too close and it killed them. And they're standing there watching that. And that's when they tell Nebuchadnezzar, our God's able to save us from that fire. But even if he does not, what he's going to do is rescue us from you. Man, I think about that. And then I get back to that in Hebrews. After it says all of those good things that it said about what happened to those people who had such faith and they conquered kingdoms, they received their dead back by resurrection, all of these things that happened by faith, then we get to this one. It says, and others, all of the success stories where God was on their side, they won, they survived, they thrived. And then it says this, and others were tortured, not accepting their release so that they might obtain a better resurrection. That's what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were saying to Nebuchadnezzar. They weren't asking to be set loose. They said, whatever happens, our God is going to rescue us even through death. And others experience mockings. You know, that's the way the persecution started in Acts. Do you remember how that developed? How the persecutions, the Lord said these persecutions are going to come upon you. He started dealing with the disciples before he died, giving them the cost of their service, telling them what was going to happen. If they're going to do it to me, rest assured, they're going to do it to you. So, he says they were stoned, they were scourged, they were put in chains and imprisoned. They were sawn in two. Oh, just think about that. Remember I talked about two kings? I talked about Hezekiah, one of the best there ever was. And then he gave birth to a son, and his son's name was Manasseh, who reigned longer than any other king in Judah. And he was the worst ever. He was worse than all of the kings of Israel. He was worse than all the kings around him. He was the worst. He took Isaiah, according to Jewish tradition. He took Isaiah and he tied him between either horses or posts, pulled him tight, and sawed his body in two. Hebrews is telling us about it. Now tell me how that fits with the image that we have. If we live like Daniel, we won't get eaten by lions. If we live like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, nothing bad, we won't burn, even if we're thrown into a fire. Because, brethren, that ain't so. The whole of the Bible prepares us. Get ready, because it might come. He goes on. He says they were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, they were put to death with the sword, they went about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute. We feel like if we live right, it's our right to be wealthy. No, it is not. Sometimes the best examples that are given are of people who are destitute. They were afflicted. They were ill-treated. And then it describes them. It says, men and women of whom the world was not worthy, wandering in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground. Even the ones who were physically victorious, like Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, suffered greatly. I want you to think about how we look at this with Daniel and his three friends. It says that they were taken. They were royals. They were the handsome ones. They were the gifted ones. They were the ones that everybody wanted to be like. They started out as as nobles. They were descendants of the royal line. Daniel in some way was evidently in line for the throne. He might have been 554 in line for the throne, but he was a noble. His life was perfect as far as you can get from wealth. It's like being it's like being Prince Harry. You know, they live a charmed life in a lot of ways. That's the way Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego were. But I want you to read this in Matthew chapter 5. He says, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven, for he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. Daniel was a good guy. So evidently was Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Good guys. They were the kind that were loyal and faithful to God. But I want you to understand something. Just like the rain falls on the good and the evil, so does the harm that comes to a people when God doesn't keep them in a position of power. When Jehoiakim and the nation was ready to fall, I'm telling you what, Daniel and his 3 friends suffered like all the rest of them. It didn't keep them from harm. I want you to think about this for a minute. You know what a maelstrom is? A maelstrom. It's a whirlpool. Anybody ever seen the Pirates of the Caribbean? Those movies where the big ships are caught in this whirlpool and down it goes. They have those in rivers. I've been close to a maelstrom. I don't ever want to get that close again. Ships are lost in those things. Big whirlpools that just take you down. Everything within reach is sucked into that and sucked into the hole. That's kind of the way it was with Daniel. He wasn't guilty. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they weren't guilty. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah weren't guilty. I remember a story that I worked at Pacific Car and Foundry. PACCAR, they called it. A big Fortune 500 company. We built railroad cars, and we repaired railroad cars. And I remember we had this beautiful opportunity. When they would tear apart a car, if the parts weren't something that they could turn in and use later, they gave them to us. These cars, these old railroad cars, had floors in them that were made of African mahogany. Whoo, that was beautiful stuff. 3x6s, 12 feet long. Just, they're scratched and they're dented and all kinds of things on the surface, but underneath and in the middle, those were some beautiful, beautiful boards. Oh, and they cost $1 million an inch to buy them. You know, slight exaggeration, but they were expensive. The company just gave those to us. You could have them. Pull your pickup in there and just load up the wood. Guess what happened? Oh, some idiot went in there and loaded up his truck full of this wood, and on the way out they stopped him and they checked him, and there was all kinds of power tools underneath the wood. Guess what happened? Guess what happened to the innocent ones? Like me. I didn't steal from them. I got shut off just like everybody else. They didn't just punish the guilty ones. All of us suffered because of that. That's the way it was with Daniel. That's the way it was with Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They weren't guilty, but they suffered. They were taken to Babylon. They went from the lap of luxury to something far, far from it. I remember also in the army, I'll tell you one more story about that. Getting caught up in the maelstrom. Jan, you remember anybody that's been in the military, you remember anything called a blanket party? A blanket party. That sounds fun, doesn't it? Well, let me tell you, it's not fun. A blanket party was usually reserved for somebody who had caused grief to the whole group, or somebody who never took a bath. They frowned on that when you didn't take a bath for a long period of time. And somebody would suggest that you stunk, and the platoon sergeant would suggest that several guys give this person a blanket party. What that means is the whole group has a responsibility for chastising this person. So they throw a blanket over their head, and everybody that's involved in this has a sock with a bar of soap in it. And you just work that feller over. That's a blanket party. That's getting caught up in the sins of one person, or not a fun thing. People suffer because of, groups of people suffer because of what one person does or a few people do. Now, you take what happened to Daniel and the rest of them, adding to the humiliation of no longer being a royal in your own family, doing what you want to do, spending the nation's money the way you want to do it. They were taken captive. And usually, like the story of Manasseh, when Manasseh was taken captive to Babylon, they put a ring in his nose and pulled behind a chariot. Think about that, how humiliating that would be, and what that would do to you if you couldn't quite keep up and you stumbled and fell. That's a horrid picture there. But as soon as they got to Babylon, you know what they did to him? Daniel, the one that we look at that no harm came to because he was a good guy and the lions didn't eat him. Let me tell you what happened to him first. Taken out of that situation of being this royal, and then taken to Babylon. First thing they did was change their names. Change their names. You know, Daniel means God is my judge. Daniel, it ends in L, means something has to do with God. So Daniel's name means judged or vindicated by God. God is my judge. You know, when they got to Babylon, they gave him the name Belteshazzar. Starts with Bel. Bel is that nickname for Marduk. And what it actually means is Bel, Marduk protects his life. Marduk is his judge. Do you know how much that had to have hurt Daniel? To go from being someone who is recognized as God is my protector, my vindicator, my judge. And then he's given this pagan name, or given into this pagan God's protection. Hananiah, the one that they named Shadrach. It means that his name means God has favored. That's what Hananiah means. It ends in AH, means Yahweh favors this person. Well, in the Chaldean language, it means he's favored by Aku, which is the moon god of Babylon. So they had to give up their names, which gave glory to God, and they had to take these names, which were an insult, every time somebody said their name. Mishael. Mishael is a great one, because, you know, Michael, the name Michael, that means who is as God. That's a powerful name for an angel, who is as God. Mishael means who is as a mighty one. That's what the angels were, is Elohim. They were, it says, Mishael was like a mighty one of God, and he was given the name who is what Aku is. taken from that position of being like one of God's angels and says he is like this God Aku. How that must have hurt them every time they heard their names mentioned. Azariah. Then Jehovah has helped him. That's what Azariah or Abednego's name was. They changed it to Abednego, which means he's a servant of Nabu, another Babylonian god. Oh, and then on top of that, there was the crowning indignation. They made eunuchs of all four of them. Do you realize what a humiliating thing that was for a Hebrew? No children. They put them in the palace. The king, and what we read about this chief official, that's rewording what it actually is. It says the head eunuch is the way that's worded in the original language. The head eunuch is training these men to be one of his. Do you think the head eunuch is going to allow these men to continue to be males? Not a chance. Not roaming around in the palace where all of the beautiful women from captivity are kept as the king's harem. They're not going to have real men in there. You know what the results of that was? You remember when Jacob was speaking when he was telling Joseph about what he was looking forward to, and he talked about the Elohim who has been my shepherd all my life and to this day, the angel who has guarded me. He said that. He said, may my name live on in these two boys. He's talking about Ephraim and Manasseh. Those two boys. He says, may my name live on in them. That was one of the most important things to a Hebrew, to a Jew, was to have descendants, to have his name carried on. It's what David counted on so much, that one of his descendants would sit upon that throne, taken away from Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and Daniel, made eunuchs in the king's court. It means they lost their property. Because if you don't have a descendant, it goes to your nearest relative. So whatever God gave them when they entered the promised land was no longer theirs. Not only were they not of the royal line, their inheritance was gone, just gone. It means they had no loyal workforce. If they ever went back to the promised land, they had no children to be their social security, if you want to put it that way. Because the sons were the social security of these people. And the worst part, if you were a eunuch, you couldn't go into the temple with the rest of the men. You had to stay out in the court of the women. And Daniel is supposed to have not suffered because the lion didn't eat him? Folks, we've got to understand what these books tell us and what they don't tell us. Let's don't get our expectations to a point where we're disappointed because something doesn't happen that we think should happen because of what we've read. Not only that, now I got to finish this. They were re-educated. They spent 3 years in the learning of the Babylonians. That means that they had to study all about these gods that they despised because they believed in the true God, the God of creation. And they changed their food. They couldn't eat what they needed to eat as Hebrews. There was no kosher grocery down at the end of the hall in the palace. They ate the king's food, which if you look at the list of things that they ate, the first thing in the list in any kind of encyclopedia is pork. Can you imagine Daniel and his 3 friends being satisfied with bacon every morning? I don't think so. You know, this put them in a position of hardship that we can't even picture. Not to mention them having to sit in a classroom and hear things that they wanted to speak out against and did later on. Babylon the Great. What do we learn from this book of Daniel? Here's what I learned. That God is in charge of those who are in charge. That's what I learned from it. I learned that Daniel is a book that tells us that no matter how bad things look, even if he does not do what we're expecting, he will rescue us from this world. That's the lesson. We're going to look at some more things about the book of Daniel. But that's what I see in the beginning of this book. God is in charge of those who are in charge. Don't ever get the idea that Babylon that we face is stronger than our God. Our God is the most powerful. He is the Most High. And that was recognized several times by this greatest of physical earthly kings, according to God. He recognized that the Most High is the ruler over the realm of mankind and bestows it on whomever he wishes. The lesson is yours. I hope that we can understand that not everything that we read in Scripture is easy to process. There are some things we've got to back up and look at from 2 or 3 different directions in order to understand them. Won't you come while we stand and sing if you're subject to the gospel call this morning?